And I was sort of curious, is there some way to represent in simple, fairly simple graphical form some of these claims about relative consumptions of carbon and the production of different goods in different countries that could be used both, for example, to provide actually quite useful information, but also in terms of pressure groups, because after all, if the thought is that we need to offset special interests, we need to put pressure on governments and so on, we need as consumers perhaps to boycott people who produce things with very high carbon levels so as not to disadvantage those who are making an effort to comply with lower ones. If we want, in other words, consumers and, in a way, citizens to have some power, then they also need information in a form that's fairly simple. And I was curious whether or not there was some way to put the sorts of claims you're making in simple graphic form. And can I just make one comment, which I hope is sympathetic to Emilios's worry? I, like you, have very strong objections to markets colonizing everything. But I don't think my objections to selling love or to selling kidneys turn on the idea that kidneys are an ill-defined asset and that there are somehow tangible goods which creates no externalities. My objections tend to be more that I don't think people should have to sell their kidneys to live, and therefore if markets and kidneys create this is a bad thing. So I was wondering whether perhaps one couldn't sort of support Emilios's worry a little more.
Thank you. Please.
I would like to make a point to Professor Varoufakis. When he started his talk, he gave as one of his particular examples the case of malaria, and was blaming on Big Pharma the fact they didn't make anti-malarial drugs because they couldn't make enough profits. This really is a gross oversimplification of the problems of the control of malaria. And there is a highly plausible case to be made, which all green campaigners should always keep deeply in mind, that the main cause for the failure of malaria eradication in the early 1970s was the decision to ban DDT, based on a novel by Rachel Carson and by a decision by William Ruckelshaus at the EPA against most available evidence. And you don't have to believe the website I'm looking at the moment that there have been 15 billion unnecessary cases of malaria since then and 100 million unnecessary deaths. But the figure is enormous. And I think it's well worthwhile for a meeting on greening humanity to bear in mind that some of the things that have been done in the cause of greening have been totally catastrophic, and that one does actually have to look at all the consequences of what one does rather than just the goodwill behind them. And having made this comment, I'd like to ask all of you a question. I'm not an economist at all, but I have sat at the feet of some very distinguished ones, such as the late Professor James Mead, who I think would have said in this sort of financial crisis, what you want to do is to raise taxes and have large infrastructure projects which may not be immediately economical, but which will be economical for our grandchildren. In the United Kingdom, for example, building tidal barrages across the Bristol Channel on the Firth of Forth. And I can tell you why the British government doesn't do it, because no government is raising taxes which won't see a benefit till they've been out of office for 10 years. But could you tell us what one actually does about that?
Remember that, yeah, but I want to conclude with all the questions, and I remember that Professor Avgouleas wanted desperately take the floor once again.
Not really. Just to complete my question, because I had left it incomplete. You're right, Yiannis. I thought you demarcated properly, but not in legally binding terms. So, what do I mean? Theoretical or conceptual definitions are fine, but they do not build global consensus. And unless you have global consensus, you will never see all that in international treaty. So the big question is, how do you make these all binding in a global governance context? And Nicholas Ashford offered a solution for a domestic context. An awfully difficult thing. You remove the special interests of the special interest groups. How do you do that? Go figure. And that's at the domestic level. Now, at the international level, Christos Pitelis offered an answer that an awful lot of people think it's fabulous. Regulatory network theory, and regulatory networks which will solve everything. But there are two problems with regulatory networks that will solve nothing. They will definitely be a collection of the great and the good and represent nobody else but the great and the good, and they will be captured by the regulated industry, whether that's financial services and Goldman Sachs or a pollutant industry.
So if you agree, I will turn now to the panelists for a last turn of answers, because by 5:30 we should have been gone. Professor.
I think you have to step one step away from the level of discussion we're having and confront some realities. One of the realities is that we are addicted to growth. We want our stock portfolio to grow. We want our bank account to grow. We want our steel industry to grow. We want our country to grow. If it doesn't grow, it's bad. We rank countries by rate of growth. We rank firms in an industry by rate of growth. And we're all complaining about the low rate of growth and thinking that we can go back to where we were, even though it was funded by borrowing from the future when we should have been saving. So how do you stop the obsession with growth? The second sacred cow is that to rethink the issue of free trade. That actually, free trade has not helped, by the way, the developing world. We all know that. And it may not even help many in the developed world. There's an economist who's a South African named Kaplinsky, who's written a very sobering picture of what the world's going to look like. One producing nation, China, with the other Asian nations being suppliers, and one retailer in the country, Tesco or Walmart or whatever, and basically no innovation and basically control of the economy. These are the special interests you're talking about that have captured the system. But let me raise one more issue, and that is I've taught at MIT for 38 years, and I was trying desperately to understand why the only people whose minds I ever changed were my students, not my colleagues. And that really bothered me for a long time. So you sit with a professor who's your colleague and you say, well, you know, ETS is not a good idea, carbon tax is better, whatever you want to talk about. And he says to you, well, your argument is really compelling. You've really changed my mind. You've opened my eyes. And 2 weeks later, he writes an article or gives a speech exactly expressing what he had before. Now, this really bothered me, so I'm trying to understand what is it? And I drew upon my training as a lawyer here. And it goes to the issue of what kind of public debate you have. We all know from psychology the problem of anchoring. If you believe in global warming, you continue to read the things that reinforce that view. If you don't believe in global warming, you gravitate towards the books, the skeptical environmentalists and everything else. And I always thought, and you probably are assuming, that if you present a balanced argument, this is for global warming, not against global warming, that if you present a cogent argument with the defenses for and against, you can shift people's minds. What the recent neuroscience shows is that if you read a balanced article, the only thing that imprints is the thing that reinforces your prior. In other words, you read a balanced article, you were against global warming, you're still even more intensely against global warming. So what is the lesson? Why is it that I've been able to change my students' mind? Because I say, Mr. Stavropoulos, tell me why this decision is right. Tell me why it is not right. Stand up when you're telling me this. I am going to have confrontation, and I'm going to make the adrenaline flow through your body. The political scene, we have the Prime Minister's questions. If you look at the Prime Minister's question, which is not repeated in any other parliament in the world as far as I can see, you really put people under heat. You really show the soft underbelly. I think we have to stop having polite arguments. I don't mean that we need to use bad language, but we not to leave anybody off the hook. We ought to really face and confront We need to do it in the media. We need to do it on a personal level. We need to do it at conferences. No, what you're saying is total rubbish. Get the adrenaline flowing. It is the only way you change people's minds. Otherwise, I've had this insight that we're just simply preaching to the converted or writing things which make no difference. Add to that the fact that the press, controlled by private industry, gives equal space to unequally meritorious ideas. You got to give equal space to evolution that you do to genetics or whatever the theories are. You're not going to shift the debate. And as a lawyer, and someone who's trained as a lawyer in my last educational, it's confrontation that produces changes, not debate, not polite society, not white papers, for what it's worth.
Dr. Hitchcock.
Okay.